So, of course, there are a lot of differences between Thoreau and Reverend C.J., and I'm not going to spin those out right now, but I'm sure you could think about differences in gender and culture and time period and so on. But what really strikes me is the extent to which Thoreau, C.J., and many of us here, I suspect, are all sitting around the same metaphorical campfire when it comes to our understanding of our deep need for open time. Now, I'm skipping over a mini reflection on spaciousness, but I just want to say that a good friend of mine and a teacher of mine often talks about time in terms of space, as do I. And I only thought of this recently, that I think one of the reasons is because we don't have time words that are open, and we have out of time and rush time and hasty time and so on, but we don't have time words, temporal vocabulary that is spacious. So we move into space metaphors. So the focus of the stories that I'm telling today, including the ones that I already gave you, have to do with the way that spirituality and time work both with and against each other. And in talking, my not-so-hidden agenda is to be pragmatic and philosophical, and I hope slightly therapeutic in terms of just listening to these voices. And the pragmatic aim, of course, is to kind of get us thinking about what we might do to leverage spirituality as we work towards the paid vacation bill. And in the session I was in just now before, somebody else, I think his name is Carl, was also talking about that, talking about how all kinds of Christians and Jews were working to uphold the Sabbath and to help create the weekend back in the early 20th century. And I think there's a way in which we can, leverage isn't my favorite word, but it's one that comes to mind, bring religious energy on this issue. My other set of research I do has to do with religion and environmental work, and over the past 10 years I've seen a real rise. I was interested in this long ago, but I've seen this real rise in religious responses, conservative, liberal, all over the map, to environmental problems, particularly climate change. So I think some of those same impulses could be used here. So that's my pragmatic part. The rest you'll see, most of this paper is philosophical. I'm looking at sort of how people experience time famine and how that relates to their spiritual practice, and in some cases, how can their spiritual practice actually hedge against time famine. And therapeutic, we'll just see if that happens or not. So, since I was Cecile Andrews earlier, I'll just put in this plug. It's now going to seem even more narcissistic if we think that I'm still Cecile Andrews, but there's this hot new book called Less is More. And in that book, I wrote a chapter about, it was called Like Corn in the Night. And so I wrote a chapter about how increasingly we are longing to grow like corn in the night. And often when I read that paragraph or so that I read you right at the beginning, I have to control myself because I get a little choked up or tears sort of come into my eyes. And I've read that passage a lot on different occasions for different reasons. And it's just that longing. How can we grow like corn in the night? And increasingly, I think we don't have the slightest idea of how to do that. And the time just isn't there, nor is the cultural support to take it. So, and those two things really go together. And even in Thoreau's time, he got plenty of flack because he was rejecting the workforce for most of his life and rejecting the market and the culture of consumption that even then was emerging. I'm skipping something I might go back to about vacation, but I think it was touched on a lot throughout the day already, which is that if you just run off for a week vacation, it's insufficient. I find when I do that I don't arrive spiritually, psychologically, or in any other way until about Wednesday of a vacation that started on Saturday, and by Thursday I'm mentally packing my bags or plotting my escape or something. So I think particularly when we talk about spiritual time and retreat, which exists in every religious tradition in one form or another, that it tells us how we really have to just unwind, get into different habits of body and soul, just sort of recover for a good chunk of time before spiritual creativity comes in and spiritual energy comes in, and just we get to know who we actually could be if we were in a quieter place, in a more open place. So what I want to do now is read another voice who is sort of struggling with the same things now about daily life that Thoreau was earlier. And I think that certainly the pressures on us today are even more soul-destroying than it was in Thoreau's time. But he was very prescient. So this is a voice of a filmmaker, Lily, and she's describing her attempts to maintain a spiritual practice, which has been part of her life for a long time. So she's not just starting up here. I am now quite immersed in ordinary life and its various pressures, family, profession, community, volunteering, etc. I try to take time each morning to open to the day in a way that centers me. I take 2 5-day retreats each year with my women's group in a setting removed from the world. I connect with a group every month that focuses on awareness and mindfulness. But I also need deep retreat time away from other human beings entirely in order to drink in the silence and spend time allowing my emotions and stress levels to recalibrate. And any time alone with a connection to nature feeds me deeply. While it would be best if I could arrange to do this every season, I'm now lucky if I can arrange it once every year or 2. The spiritual connection cultivated in extended periods of solitude certainly helps to keep my balance in the ever-accelerating pace of our times. I can now see why a day of Sabbath was scheduled into the weeks of many religions. My system needs this time to remember, and she says remember, like put the members of the body back. It needs this time. It's clear in my own life and in those I see around me that continuous pursuit of daily business, breathing out, without time to stop, look around, reflect, breathing in, wears one down and causes one to lose a sense of the larger meaning or purpose of life. Lily describes herself as someone who was once involved in organized religion, but is now focused on cultivating spirituality outside of a particularly religious frame. So she would fit the famous in religious academic circles, spiritual but not religious term, which is full of problems, but I won't go there. The shorthand is you can be spiritual and religious, you can be spiritual and not religious. There are many ways to be spiritual. But her comments, even though she has left organized religion, which was Christian in her upbringing, her comments sound uncannily like the words of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel of blessed memory, who in 1951 published a little book entitled The Sabbath. I'm just curious, has anyone read The Sabbath? I wouldn't, okay, good, oh, excellent, because I think the book is not widely known. It needs a comeback. In The Sabbath, Heschel makes the crucial point that Shabbat's central role in Jewish life is not intended to send a message against the world of work, which is useful to emphasize for our purposes. It's not intended to send a message against the world of work, but rather is meant to underline the deep reciprocal relationship between being and doing, being and doing, doing and being. Heschel writes, "The Sabbath as a day of abstaining from work is not a deprecation, but an affirmation of labor, a divine exaltation of its dignity." What many of us recognize as a spiritual requirement, having time in our lives not only to do but also to be, has been reinforced, for those who need such reinforcement, by various studies that have shown that worker productivity goes up when workers are given more flexibility, shorter work weeks, and more vacation. Now, as a religion professor, not to mention as a human being, I admit that worker productivity is not on the top of my list of concerns. But I certainly think it's an important factor. But I do find it fascinating that these contemporary social scientific studies are a kind of commentary on Torah, a kind of commentary on the Bible in a certain way about productivity and rest. Of course, the Sabbath has meant different things at different times, but always it has meant a renouncing of the daily world of getting and spending and an embrace of the primacy of the life of the Spirit. And as most of us know, Judaism, Christianity, Islam all have various forms of Sabbath. And these have kept us from the potentially dehumanizing intertwined forces of overwork, overconsumption, and disconnection from one another. And here comes another voice. And this is the voice of a rabbi, a friend, and who's very prominent in her work, part of which involves revitalizing Shabbat, so it's not just sort of the routine that young Jews fled because it was boring and they couldn't play, but actually is bringing Shabbat into a great sense of joyousness and celebration and ecological consciousness and so on. And as a result, lots of young Jews have sort of come back into the fold in a new way.